Okay, so want to go ahead and finish this presentation that we were looking at today. I get so wrapped up in Kennedy that I lose time on this, but I think it's kind of fun and kind of breaks up the monotony of just talking about stuff all the time. So um, we talked about Kennedy getting elected, how his election represented kind of this new generation that he described. Um, Kennedy promised to kind of expand the welfare state here and was looking at passing some fairly large civil rights legislation and asks, of course, for a huge tax cut in 1963. Now, of course, what happens is Kennedy dies, and then what we see here is Johnson is going to have to pick up where Kennedy left off. And I told you, Johnson is a very different guy than Kennedy. Unlike Kennedy, he had a lot of political experience. Um, he had been in the Texas House of Representatives, then to the Senate, and he was a Senate Majority Leader. I mean, all of this stuff was stuff that Kennedy didn't have. The other thing, Johnson was very, very ambitious. He also had a kind of I guess you'd say like a kind of dirty-ish sense of humor. He also was known for having very bad language. He swore a lot, and Johnson was a fairly tall guy, and this what they usually kind of refer to as the treatment. Johnson would tower over people, and he would get like uncomfortably close to them. Basically he would go like nose to nose with them, and he used this kind of like as an intimidation, and it usually worked. It kind of got him what he needed. Now Johnson does want to continue what Kennedy had started, and so he will help get those large Kennedy tax cuts that he proposed in 63 passed in 1964. In addition, what you're going to see is the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which Kennedy had proposed, but once again had died before it was able to go through. And Johnson is responsible for getting that in. And this was one of the strongest civil rights legislations since Reconstruction. And Johnson had to really fight hard to get Southern Democrats to support this thing. But he does. And this is really important because I know a lot of films recently in popular culture have kind of depicted Johnson as this like villain of civil rights, when in fact, no president probably did more to help the Civil Rights Act get passed in 64 than Johnson did. Um, in addition, Johnson wanted to continue with Kennedy's promise of declaring war on poverty. And so Kennedy Johnson, in January of 1964 says that he is going to declare a war on poverty. And what he's going to do is start with the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. And this created a series of programs. And these programs, it also created a new, it's called the Office of Economic Opportunity. And basically what these programs did was they targeted youth, um, preschoolers even. It created work study grants for college students. It created the Job Corps for people who maybe were like graduating from college and couldn't find anything. It also provided loans to businesses who would hire people for long-term employment. It gave aid to farmers. You had the Volunteers in Service to America, which is called the VISTA program, which paid salaries to workers. It also provided legal services like lawyers for people who couldn't afford them. And then you had the Community Action Plan called CAP. And this required that you had to participate some like maximum, they call it maximum feasible participation. Um, and what this meant was, of course, that you had to kind of work, you had to prove that you were working in order to take advantage of this. And all these were, designed to help get people employed, to get people paychecks so that they would spend money and kind of keep the economy going. Now, what you see happening here is that it was very hard to keep people accountable on some of these programs. And you had, people who were complaining that Johnson was basically creating this like class struggle, this divide between the poor and the rich, um, and The CAP program itself, though, I mean, it did help a lot of people. It gave people jobs. It also got people back to school so that way they could learn to read and write to help them get jobs. And so CAP was actually a fairly successful program. Um, Johnson comes up for re-election in 1964. He's running against a Republican senator from Arizona called Barry Goldwater. And Goldwater attacks the welfare state. He says that, we're basically creating handouts. And he also says that we needed to use nuclear weapons if necessary in Vietnam to fight communism. And Goldwater is going to lose. He'll get a couple southern states, which was a surprise because Johnson was a southerner. But Johnson wins the election in 1964 and is now president for his own term. And so what we're going to see here is Johnson's. So you had Kennedy's New Frontier. Johnson has Great Society. That's the name of his program. And what he does is he is going to push Congress to try and take more action in terms of civil rights. He's kind of hoping that by doing so he can continue to get votes from African American communities. What we're also going to see here is what we just talked about, this Economic Opportunity Act. That was kind of the first step that he wanted to do. Well, now that he gets reelected, Johnson is going to seek to kind of do a couple other things. You get the Model Cities Act of 1966. You have the aid to families with dependent children, which eased restrictions on welfare recipients so more people could have access to it. You're also going to, Johnson, who was a former school teacher, he's also going to use this to kind of work on elementary and secondary education. And so you get his Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. And what this will do here is this will basically send federal funds to schools who are in poverty and help these schools to educate poor children, improve the conditions in the schools. It's going to help create new buildings, programs, scholarships, all of this stuff to help get more kids through school. There'll be a new food stamp program, rent supplements, and all of this, of course, is kind of going to fighting this war on poverty. You're also going to see the programs of Medicare and Medicaid, which are going to help the elderly and poor who could not generally afford such things. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 banned literacy tests, so that way in the South took away another one of the excuses that they were using to go after black voters. And it also said on top of that, if you were keeping blacks from voting, this was unconstitutional. Therefore, the FBI could come down and they could investigate and they could actually arrest people for doing this. Another thing that you're going to see here is the Immigration and National Act of 1965, and this got rid of quotas for immigrants from regions outside of Northern and Western Europe. And remember, this had been in place because basically this affected Eastern Europeans, and we were worried about communism, and so with this, it opened our borders up for these people who were escaping the Soviet Union to come to the United States to live. Johnson is also going to look into some environmental programs. Nixon will really be the president that kind of takes action in terms of environmental stuff. But what you're going to see is Johnson wants to control water and air pollution. His wife is going to have a lot to do with this. She's looking at creating like environmental programs that would address pollution. But Johnson will also in 1968, and this is when he's really starting to kind of lose influence, mostly because of the Vietnam War, he's going to get another civil rights law out that banned discrimination in housing and jury service. And this is going to come kind of at the very end here. And then you've got the National Housing Act of 1968, which authorized an enormous increase in construction of low-income housing for the poor. And like I said, those two were really difficult because, basically, like I said, uh, the Vietnam War had just destroyed his leadership. And so that was really tough for him to get those. So, in the end, assessing his presidency, his war on poverty did not redistribute national income, meaning that you didn't really see, um, the poor kind of break out of poverty, and the rich, get taxed a huge amount, and that money kind of get redistributed. Um, Now, conservatives said that the programs, discouraged initiative. They said that because they were giving out all these handouts, these welfare things, that people didn't want to go to work. People would rather just kind of get a handout from the government. And liberal critics said that by focusing too much on training and education, that you basically made the poor, you kind of said, well, you have to have an education and training in order to get out of poverty. Um, and even when they got the education and the training, that they usually got really low paying jobs. And so you had critics on both sides of this program who were, saying that he didn't either go far enough or he went too far. At the same time, physicians and hospitals end up raising their fees because of Medicare and Medicaid. And this will also be kind of a big problem because, as we're seeing now, we're still seeing medical costs increase, and a lot of these programs has caused them to go up. Some people said that in order for you to totally end poverty, you would have to go even farther than Johnson did, and you would literally have to redistribute income. Um, but Johnson doesn't go that far. All right, and then this is very important, guys. This is the Warren Court. So in the 1960s, the Supreme Court Chief Justice was a guy by the name of Earl Warren, and he was in from 53 to 69. Brown versus Board of Education. That's gonna be one of his big cases, and you're also gonna have a lot of other cases that dealt with kind of civil liberties. Loving versus Virginia struck down a law that banned interracial marriages. Baker versus Carr, which was what Chief Justice Warren thought was his biggest achievement, which was the principle of one person, one vote. You also had Gideon versus Wainwright, Miranda versus Arizona. All of these were really, really important cases. And like I said, under a more liberal court, these cases are going to be decided in that fashion. And a lot of them are about equality and individual rights. And so one of the big things that causes a lot of problems was the Abington School District versus Shemp. And this said that a Pennsylvania law requiring Bible reading and prayer in the schools violated the First Amendment. And this particular court case was important because basically what you ended up seeing here was that you couldn't really have public prayer in school. And of course, a lot of religious people were very angry over this and said, you're attacking religion, you're removing it from schools. Um, Now, you had a couple justices who didn't always agree with Earl Warren, said that the court was going too far, but a lot of these cases have still stood up since. And so, like I said, this is probably one of the most influential Supreme Courts that we've ever had.